This afternoon, I'm talking to Helen Zille, the chairperson of the Federal Executive of the Democratic Alliance, and I think fair to say one of our country's most experienced and senior politicians. Helen has been MEC for Education in the Western Cape, a Member of Parliament, Executive Mayor of Cape Town, Premier of the Western Cape Province. So one of the few politicians, I think, who has worked at all three levels of government, and indeed also in the executive and at provincial level and in the legislature. So quite a career over the last 3 decades or so. Thanks for your time. We're talking about coalition governance. It's obviously much in the news at the moment. We've had a lot of experience of coalitions at municipal level, especially in some of the metropolitan municipalities. But the dominant impression, I think one can say, is one of instability. From your perspective, what are the main causes of this instability?
Well, I've been in coalitions now since 1999. That was the first coalition in the New South Africa. And that was a coalition in the Western Cape between the former NNP and the former DP. And then in 2006, I was the mayor of Cape Town and we had a 7-party coalition. Both those coalitions were very stable while they lasted. And we didn't have any of the kinds of problems we have today with coalitions. But the reason that the coalitions today are extremely unstable is that coalition agreements are not worth the paper they are written on. And coalition negotiations have nothing to do with principle or policy or delivery plans. They have everything to do with bribery and extortion. And smaller parties just trade themselves off between the two bigger parties and sell themselves to the highest bidder. They'll come quite openly to the DA and say, well, the ANC's offered us X, now what do you plan on offering us? So it's literally an auction. And the smaller parties, not all of them, but some of them auction themselves off to the highest bidder. And then they can bring down the government, and they do repeatedly by moving between the bigger parties. That's one of the key reasons.
Right. Now, I suppose as an attempt to combat some of this or improve the situation, the Democratic Alliance has introduced a private members bill, which aims to facilitate more stable coalition governance. And you've got 5 action points contained in this bill. Can you take us through the 5 points briefly?
Well, really 3 main ones, but the 3 bills and the 3 main issues that we're trying to achieve is a constitutional and a legislative change, which will limit motions of no confidence to 1 a year. Mm-hmm. In the current situation, we have motions of no confidence coming every couple of months, depending on which side one or other of the smaller parties wishes to associate with. Yeah. And it's quite impossible to govern in a context where a mayor is facing a vote of no confidence every 3 months. Makes governance quite impossible. It makes spending and planning the budget entirely impossible. And so we believe it is compatible with democracy to say there must only be a motion of no confidence once every year, if at all, and then there can be contingencies made for motions of no confidence where there's been a clear violation of the law and the Constitution and other egregious acts by the office bearer. But in general, when they are just random motions of no confidence without any firm basis in the law, then we would like to minimize those to 1 a year. The second issue we need is to give us a longer time period to constitute a council after a local government election. Currently, you have 14 days, and that is absolutely ridiculous to try and negotiate a local government coalition agreement. In Germany, they take months and months, for example, to get all the I's dotted and the T's crossed. And we'd certainly like a longer time to make the agreements more comprehensive, and also to try and get mechanisms in play that can make them enforceable. Because currently, coalition agreements just really are not worth the paper they're written on. People violate them all the time, and nothing can happen to them. So there are no consequences for breaking your word or violating the agreement. Then the third crucial thing, of course, is the thresholds. Now, there's been a major outcry from some parties about the thresholds, and they want to make out that somehow it's undemocratic to have a threshold, or that it violates the proportional representation system. It does neither. Thresholds are in place in every single proportional representation system that I know of anywhere in the world. And the one that we are proposing at 1%, so a party would have to get 1% of the vote in that specific sphere of government to get any representation at all. Ours at 1% would be the lowest in the world. So the bar would be set very low. You wouldn't need to get more than 1% to have representation. And we say that if a party can't even mobilize 1%, let's say, of the residents in a particular locality where they have a municipality, then frankly, they can't demonstrate any meaningful voter support. And so we avoid the situation, for example, where 5 parties that have less than 1% each has the balance of power and each can bring down the government when they choose. In other countries, it's usually 5%. The lowest I know of elsewhere in the world is 2%. And in Argentina, it's 3%. So all over the world, you have thresholds, and it's totally compatible with the proportional representation system, because our constitution says the result must be generally proportional. So it doesn't say exactly proportional. And in any case, as we sit here right now, we already exclude people who can't make the threshold for 1 seat. There is a threshold for 1 seat. It is the number of voters divided by the number of seats, and then you get the threshold for 1 seat, and that already exists. To make it 1% is really no change at all. And sometimes in local government elections on a remainder, you can get in and have the balance of power while you didn't even reach the threshold for 1 seat.
Yeah.
So it's a ridiculous system, and it absolutely builds instability into our constitutional dispensation, and it's time to stabilize coalitions.
Can I just ask on that question, if we look at the national parliament, for example, at the moment, if you happen to get 1% of the vote, you get 4 seats because there are 400 seats. Now, your proposal would exclude a party that, let's say, gets enough votes for 3 seats, 0.75%. And yet from next year's election, we're going to find independents will be able to stand, and an independent could get a seat in parliament with 0.25%. Isn't that incongruous then to exclude parties that may earn 3 seats but allow into the assembly an independent who's only earned 1 seat?
Well, imagine that the threshold, the automatic threshold that currently exists, will be about 50,000 votes. So basically, the argument is that if an independent in a particular geographic constituency, which is the size of the province, can make 50,000 votes, they get a seat. Now, we happen to think that this system is going to make Parliament potentially as unstable as local government coalitions. And we don't think it's going to be helpful to make more and more very, very small parties and independents come in, be parties of one. Then they are leaders of political parties, so that gives them a huge extra whack of salary. And it's a huge incentive to go and try and see if you can make the seat on a fraction of a remainder. And so that is a real serious problem. And I would hate the new system to replicate local government instability in Parliament.
Is it a principle in the DA's view that the largest party in any particular legislature should always be the leader of the coalition?
It's not an absolute cardinal principle in coalition formation. I mean, positions can be negotiated for different parties in the quest to achieve a compromise. But what is entirely unacceptable is if a party that could not even get 1% of the vote becomes the mayor in a city of 6 million people like Johannesburg. That, we believe, is an entirely undemocratic outcome. It's not the consequence of a negotiation for a coalition. And we think that coalition formations and agreements can often undermine democracy, not promote it.
Now, you've already mentioned in terms of the threshold, the situation in some other countries in the world. But we know that in Europe, for example, many of the democracies there have a long history of very effective coalition governance, especially at national level. Where should we be looking to learn lessons about how to make a success of it?
Well, I've been to Germany. I know a lot about the German system, and you just can't compare our country with anything that goes down there. I mean, I don't really think we can learn any lessons from there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for them, the coalition agreement is sacrosanct. And if a party were to violate the coalition agreement, no one would vote for them again. I mean, it's a completely different culture. When I tell people from abroad the kinds of things that go on and the bargaining and the extortion and the bribery that happens in coalition formations, they can't believe it. But this is absolutely standard practice here. And if you, let's say, expose that eventuality or those happenings in the South African system, the voters aren't put off at all by it. So, there's no consequences for this kind of behavior in South Africa, but there would be formidable consequences for any of the other proportional systems that I know of in the rest of the world, certainly in countries like Germany, certainly in Denmark, even in Argentina and places like that. So we must just understand that our voters aren't put off by things that voters in many other countries are put off by. I mean, no party in one of those countries, except maybe for Argentina, but not even there, would re-elect a government like the ANC. I mean, there's just recently been a scandal, very similar to the information scandal when I was a journalist, that brought down a government. Now it doesn't even make reporting in the newspaper.
Yeah. Now, you're talking about how our voters would react to such, to this kind of sort of scandalous behavior around coalitions and how different that is from other countries. Another thing that seems to affect our voters from comments that one hears and reports is that some of them see the idea of coalition governance as a betrayal, because they say, we've voted for Party X. We didn't want Party X to get into bed with Party Y. They are betraying our vote. Policies have to be compromised, etc. How do you as a political party go about explaining to your supporters that you may need to, so as it were, get into bed with another party?
We simply say, you didn't give us enough votes. Obviously, we'd like not to be in coalition. The first prize is to have a true blue government. Everywhere that there is a true blue government, from Umgeni to Midvaal to Cape Town and Mossel Bay, you have decent governance. So obviously, we'd much rather not be in coalition. But if we don't get enough votes, there's no option unless we go into opposition. So the choices are very limited. If not enough voters vote for us, we either go into opposition or we go into coalitions, some of which turn out to be very unsatisfactory.
Mm-hmm. There does seem to be a kind of educative effort needed, perhaps, to explain the ins and outs of coalitions to the electorate as a whole, not just to DA voters, but to everyone in the electorate. We've become so used to the single party dominance over the last almost 30 years, and next year could bring about quite a significant change from that. I mean, I'm just wondering whether our voters on average, are ready for it.
Well, as I say, I've been in coalitions since 1999, and it's the only, except for a while, no, for the two governments I was in, we had coalitions, and for the other two governments I was in, we had an overall majority. Of course, it's a lot easier to govern when you have an overall majority. But coalitions are not new in South Africa, not at all. And I think many, many people have lived under some form of coalition. In Gauteng, the experience has been disastrous. In the Western Cape, not so much. So people understand if you don't get enough votes, you go into coalition or you go into opposition. That's all there is to say.
Now, looking towards next year, some opinion polls suggest that the ANC will dip below 50% nationally. It looks inevitable that there will be coalitions in Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, possibly the Northern Cape, and possibly even the Western Cape, depending how things go for you. What happens if, or let's put it this way, is it feasible for parties to enter into a coalition with one another, let's say at national level, but then remain in opposition to each other at provincial level, or vice versa, have provincial coalitions, but be at each other's throats nationally. How does that work?
Well, that is feasible. You don't have to be in the coalition or the party everywhere. You can be the opposition in some places and you can be with them in coalition in other places. It just depends on the circumstances. We don't have that kind of situation at the moment. And currently, we've made it very clear that we won't vote for parties that said one thing and did another thing. But yeah, I mean, you can. It depends on the localities, it depends on the issues, and it depends on the possibilities. Whenever we faced in a situation where we don't get 50% and no party gets 50%, and we have to decide what to do, we take what we call the least bad option. So we look at all of the options in front of us. We say, what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario, tragically, is what they've got in Ekurhuleni and Johannesburg and Mogale City, which is an ANC-EFF coalition. That is the worst case scenario, and those poor cities are feeling it now. But we work backwards from that. The most important thing to prevent is an ANC-EFF coalition, and then we go to less bad scenarios down the line until we can get the best of the least bad, if you get what I mean. So that's the objective. You can't get what you want. It's not a perfect world. If not enough voters vote for you, then they can't get blue government. People in Gauteng are very upset with us, for example. They say, why did you let the ANC and EFF govern Johannesburg? And my response to them is very simple. If you only give us 26% of the vote, you can't expect us to bring miracles.
Right. This last weekend, there was a big conference at the University of the Western Cape, a big consultation on coalition governance. It was very interesting to see the leaders, or most of the leaders of the political parties, the deputy leader of the ANC, sitting in the front row. Mr. Steenhuisen was there, Mr. Lekota, all the party political leaders, just about with the exception of the EFF, were there, and interesting debates. How's the DA feeling about what was discussed there? Do you think progress was made?
Well, in my perception of the first day, very little progress was made. It was very notable to me that out of all the speakers, not a single one had direct personal experience of negotiating a coalition or managing a coalition or governing in a coalition. So that was an interesting feature of it to me. But, you know, the ANC put out what they wanted to achieve, and we listened to them and they listened to us. And then there was some discussion. And then we all went home.
All right. Some commentators seem to be taking a rather more positive view of what happened there, but I suppose time will tell. Final question.
Well, I mean, nothing was really achieved there. Absolutely nothing that I could see. But I mean, I only stayed for the first day. Let me put that that disclaimer on it. I only stayed for the first day. But, you know, everything was predictable and we heard what everyone had to say. And yeah, I'm not cynical. I just know that in those public forums, no progress happens. I've been around long enough to know that.
You've mentioned that your ideal, obviously, and the same would go for any party politician, is to win any election outright and not have to have a coalition. But is there room, given our history and our divisions of the past and all that sort of thing, is there room to view the possibility of coalitions at national level and provincial level in a more positive light, along the lines of, you know, the government of national unity idea, that the bigger parties can possibly come together to tackle the huge challenges that we face as a country? Can we see it as I say, as a positive option rather than just as the least bad option?
You know, we have to look at examples from comparable situations. As I said, Denmark, Germany, Israel, all of these countries are not examples for South Africa because our culture is totally and fundamentally different. Let's look at Zimbabwe, which is a much more relevant comparison. In Zimbabwe, the movement for democratic change was totally annihilated in the coalition with ZANU-PF, and ZANU-PF just use the MDC to prop up their corrupt rule. So that is the great risk of this whole approach, that anybody going into it will just simply be swallowed up by the wave of ANC cadres and ANC cadre deployment and not be able to take a firm stand on it. Obviously, we have learned a very, very deep lesson from that kind of scenario, and it holds tremendously negative risks for parties. The ANC is a juggernaut. It doesn't brook opposition, and what it does to stay in play and ensure its survival is going to be pretty ruthless down the line.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure that's a positive note to end on, but possibly.
Well, we can end on a positive note. I mean, people know the difference between ANC and DA government. They know it. They've seen it. DA government is especially better for the poor because they get all their basic services. They get the free basic service allocation. And despite the fact that where DA governs, people vote with their feet in tremendous numbers to get to those forms of government, they often vote in a very different way, which is something that still needs explaining to me. But nevertheless, I can't dictate voter choice. We can just put our offer on the table for them. The truth is that right here in South Africa, we have localities going forward under DA government where poor people get far more opportunities with functioning schools, functioning clinics, functioning service delivery, functioning transport networks, and all of those sorts of things. We've got those things to offer, and people can make this comparison, not internationally, but right here in South Africa. And people must just link the way they vote with the way they ultimately live and understand that under the DA, things progressively improve, while under other parties, things progressively decline. Surely that should be enough of a positive ending to this little story to give a lot of hope for the future.
Helen Zille, Chair of the Federal Executive of the Democratic Alliance, thanks very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Mike.